Welcome to Windows on the World. Sorry, another false start again tonight. The broadcaster jammed once more. But tonight I want to do a show about subversion in the media and beyond. Recently, things have come to light which have exposed what is called counterintelligence, both in the media and coming from the deep state. And to start the show off, I just want to read something out from a psychology handbook. This is quite interesting and it will tie into what we're going to talk about. It says here, there is then a close relationship between the evolution of mental abilities and social behaviour. Indeed, society itself is ultimately a product of biological evolution. This is not to say that there are not problems in applying evolutionary theory to social phenomena, but clarification of the problems illuminates both biological and social psychology. Natural selection operates on individuals and on inherited characteristics, but many social tendencies, such as altruism, seem to decrease an individual's chances of survival and so should not exist. Now, the sort of people who believe that nonsense are the sort of people who work for the intelligence services. They believe in this kind of weird social Darwinism. And I can say that with some authority because I've met quite a lot of these goons or come across them, because years ago, when I first started getting into this, until I got wise to it all and basically got away from groups, that's one of the most important things to ever do if you want to put news out, is to get out of groups. Maybe form your own private ones, but certainly don't join groups which become organisations and then take on leaders. You know the type of leaders we're talking about, the people who come out of nowhere with assumed authority. But this is all quite interesting. It's tying in today because I've been looking at lots of different stuff. And you've even got Sarah Sanders doing a press conference in America on behalf of Trump administration. And the press have a go at her for basically not giving them a fair ride. And she absolutely lacerates them with all the personal hatred that they've spewed against her. It's actually quite funny. But another thing I want to talk about is the so-called Freedom Act, which is going to replace basically the terrorism laws in America that came up after 9/11. And this act would actually legitimise all spying all the time on all of us in ways that the Patriot Act fails to do. It is no protection of privacy. It is no protection of constitutional liberty. It unleashes American spies on innocent Americans in utter disregard of the Fourth Amendment. Now, this is actually what's happened in the UK, the very same thing. In other words, data mapping and privacy do not go hand in hand. They do not exist together. They cannot exist together. However, news in this week is that Amazon's facial recognition software is racist. Basically, what's happened is it's 90% ineffective, as is the facial recognition software used by the police in the UK. And also, it seems to go massively against people who aren't white. So it's a huge own goal for the extreme leftists. Isn't it great when that happens? However, we're going to carry on now with a story that was in Rolling Stone, which is in terms of propaganda, it's on a par with the New York Times, I would say. But it said 70% of Americans get their news from just two sources, Facebook and Google. As that number rises, the power of just a few people to decide what information does and does not reach the public will amplify significantly. It says, carries on here, that all changed with digital media. Way back in 1996, when mastodons roamed the earth and people used dial-up to connect to the internet, Congress passed the Communications Decency Act. It contained the following landmark language: no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Well, there's certain court cases recently, which listeners to this show will know about, which directly contradict that. But it's been quite an interesting day looking at the news, and funnily enough, I mean, talking about Facebook, which I don't go on very often, I posted this thing up of that Tommy Robinson, Four Names Robinson, the fraudster, and I didn't even really look what he was saying or what it was really about. I was going to read it out on the show, and all of a sudden, I've got this guy going on there, Mark, I'm now sure that you must be working with Soros. And all these people started attacking me for no reason, and I couldn't work out why. It was about 3 of them, right? And so I've just taken it down, but I didn't even quite know the context of it. I put it there to actually look at, but it was just him talking a load of crap. But underneath it, I'd posted something much funnier, right? This is really, really funny. It's on Facebook, and it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen. It's got 2 pictures of Tommy Fraudster, Stephen Yaxley or Harris, whatever he calls himself, and it's really, really funny, right? Because it's got Tommy Robinson before Zionist funding, yeah, and his teeth look as though they need doing, right? And it's got Tommy Robinson after Zionist funding, and it's got like this new set of gnashes, and it's one of the most funny things I've ever seen. It's on the Facebook page, but I've deleted the other one because they all seem to be arguing over it, which is the point of Facebook. I mean, it's quite funny that there's certain people that go in on there, and apart from the divide and rule strategy that Facebook is brilliant for, they actually get completely the wrong idea. In other words, they contradict what you actually mean. So you end up in almost like a counterintelligence hellhole, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. It's really quite amusing stuff, but it was about 2 minutes to the show, and I just said, going live in 2 minutes, and there's these people saying, Mark, FFS, what are you posting this for? I don't know, well, because I haven't actually heard it, but the thing is that it's just him lying his arse off as usual, But I wanted to just mention something before we get started. I want to do a series of audio books, and I just wanted to test out how interested people may or may not be in this, because I'm going to link up with a producer friend of mine who contacted me the other day, and it was actually the same guy who recorded the opening theme for Windows on the World a few years ago, and we've worked together over the years. And he just got in touch by chance the other day saying, would you be interested in setting up, maybe doing some audio books, which made me look into this idea. And I've amassed this extraordinary amount of information and documents over the years, and I've been sent so many of these rare texts. And I was just wondering if there'd be a market out there for kind of basically editing this stuff and presenting it as a series. I mean, it's quite esoteric stuff, but in actual fact, most of it is extremely practical. Put it out in a series of audio books presenting very useful information, which will form this series. And basically, all this masses of information that I've got. I mean, I've got hard drives full of stuff that I've been sent, and I'd really like to kind of put it out in a logical way. I mean, what happens during the week with the shows is that I tend to get a lot of stuff which I want to put into the shows, and it's hard to keep them completely focused on one thing, even though we've done several sort of specials like last week with the Rosicrucians. But that is in actual fact something that ties into everything. But it would be great to actually get some sort of narrative going on this and be able to put the stuff out, probably help maybe to fund what I'm doing a bit and pay some of the expenses. They'd obviously be quite cheap to download, and we'd do them professionally in a studio. So basically really high quality audio books. Just a thought. Barbara's coming here. The value of altruism is apparent to anyone who has put themselves out for someone else's child. The parents love you forever. Exactly. In actual fact, when they talk about social Darwinism, it's actually crazy, because the things they talk about are self-defeating. I've always found that basically offering help actually brings rewards. So even the social Darwinists don't realise. They think like, well, a lot of this comes out of public school mentality. I mean, I used to do sort of entertainment for people, sort of landed gentry, and you'd go to these sort of large houses and estates, and they'd make their children be incredibly competitive and basically traumatise them. And the children became absolutely obnoxious. I remember one day I was sent by a friend, and she wanted me to take over this. Basically, it was like entertaining some kids and adults with magic tricks and stuff, which I used to do. And it turned out to be the daughter of Nicholas Soames. And when I got there, she actually said, "Come on, magician, chop, chop." I couldn't believe it. I was like absolutely flabbergasted. She was about 8 years old. Imagine what that's going to be like now. You know, probably worse than her father. Only joking, Nicholas, or am I? So, yeah, I've just been looking at quite a lot of news, you know, things that have come in. Now, it's in quite an interesting twist to all this. Steve Bannon is actually going to start a sort of a think tank kind of organisation, which is going to challenge Soros. And I think that's really funny, because it's all going to be, so it's basically we talk about two heads of the same beast here, but I think it's a really, really funny idea, because it'd redress the balance a bit, I suppose. It'd be quite amusing. But yeah, that's something that's just come in today. I've just been looking at, and this computer's actually frozen, so I'll go back to that maybe a little bit later on. But good evening, everybody in chat. The Tommy Robinson psychological operation has all the hallmarks of its backers now. I mean, it is funny. I mean, that thing that happened on Facebook, I couldn't believe it, you know. And I often find this with that. I think Facebook's actually dying now. I think it's finished, really, because it seems to be more like a sort of television station now. You get all this stuff that comes up, which is basically adverts with these videos that pop up. Yeah, it's getting more and more irritating, but I've never really taken it that seriously. I think this is, has it come up now? I think this is one from Zero Hedge, yeah. Bannon sets up for EU showdown with George Soros, okay, which is quite amusing. And basically, it says Steve Bannon plans to lead a populist revolt through Europe, which, if successful, will crush George Soros and his network of open border NGOs to smithereens, according to the Daily Beast. I mean, wouldn't that just be funny? So you construct this sort of alt-right, which has been constructed by the extreme left, and then that alt-right sets up its own think tank, which is in direct opposition to the funders of it, which are the extreme left. It says the non-profit will be a central source of polling, advice on messaging, data targeting and think tank research for a ragtag band, it says up here, of right-wingers who are surging all over Europe. Well, in actual fact, that's quite amusing, because Viktor Orban has just, this is Hungary's Prime Minister, he's just come up with his own definitions of what his country should be, and it's actually very, very mild indeed, but they're all saying, oh, this is terrible, you know, this is absolutely awful. What can we do to stop this evil? You know, this is the same guy who is basically protecting his own people. But Orban says, this is an excerpt from Prime Minister Viktor Orban's speech at the 29th Summer Open University and Student Camp. And he says, the first is that every European country has the right to defend its Christian culture and the right to reject the ideology of multiculturalism. Oh, well, that's fighting talk, isn't it? That these days, that's tantamount to being called Hitler. Our second tenet is that every country has the right to defend the tradition family model, and it's entitled to assert that every child has the right to a mother and a father. Oh, my God. Can you think of anything more subversive than that? The third Central European tenet is that every Central European country has the right to defend the nationally strategic economic sectors and markets which are of crucial importance to it. Oh my God, can you imagine what the Remainers would say about that in the UK? The fourth tenet is that every country has the right to defend its borders and it has the right to reject immigration. Oh my God, he's an absolute hate-filled racist, isn't he? And the fifth tenet is that every European country has the right to insist on the principle of one nation, one vote on the most important issues, and that this right must not be denied in the European Union. God, this guy is really pushing the boat out here, which is quite extraordinary. I wonder if anyone else will copy him. Wouldn't that be good? In other words, we Central Europeans claim that there is life beyond globalism, which is not the only path. Central Europe's path is the path of an alliance of free nations. Well, that's quite incredible, that, isn't it? Now, psychological subversion, that's something I really wanted to talk about this week. And I was going to take you back into some early years of Windows on the World, when we used to get these sort of low-level goons attacking us. And what's made me bring this up is that the ex-E17 singer Brian Harvey, who I've been in contact with for quite a few years, has actually unwittingly and wittingly exposed this counterintelligence operation and how it works. And I have spoken to him quite a bit about this in the past, because this same group that he's exposed, and I won't be naming anyone tonight, but for a very good reason, I'll tell you why. Because I've been troll-free for quite a long time. And when this stuff happened to me about 4 or 5 years ago, and during the time I was at the People's Voice TV station, I was the subject of a lot of attacks by these sort of subversives. And basically what it does is it takes your eye off the ball in certain respects, because what you have to do is you have to defend yourself. And the subversion that I've seen and experienced over the years, and even recently with my friend's charity, which is basically subversion and financial terrorism, which is basically like an intelligence services operation. And the reason I do want to talk about it is because people can easily deal with this stuff when they find out how it works or doesn't work, because when they call this stuff intelligence, it's overrating it a bit. What it means is that the public are manipulated in a certain way and can be easily manipulated in a certain way. And I wanted to basically read out a couple more quotes from this book on psychology, because all of this is about psychological subversion. And if we look at this is on page 53 of this psychological handbook. It says, even though most critics now accept that psychologists must try to explain mental processes by collecting behavioural and self-report data, there are some who argue that problems with this activity means that psychological knowledge will remain trivial. It has not and will not advance significantly beyond the unsystematic common sense knowledge. Now, we were talking about this, well, we've been talking about this for quite a long time, that you can't beat common sense, that has the common sense knowledge it carries on, that has accumulated over millennia. Well, I wonder why it's accumulated over millennia as common sense. I wonder why the psychologists have never thought of consulting that. Several arguments lie behind this pessimism it carries on. First, it is very difficult to do experiments which test the hypothesis the experimenter wishes to test. This applies particularly to social situations and is associated with the phenomenon of the self-fulfilling prophecy. If a person thinks that he is a certain kind of a person, or that the experimenter expects him to perform certain kinds of action, then this will influence his behaviour, usually in the direction of the expectation. An amusing example of this is the claim that Freud's patients dreamed the kind of dreams that his theory led him to expect, whereas Jung's patients dreamed of very different kinds of dreams that his views required. Now, this is called the narrow corridor of opinion, or artificial wombs. People retreat into artificial wombs and hear what they want to hear and gravitate to what they want to hear. And that's a perfect example of those people who were arguing amongst themselves and with me on Facebook when I didn't even know what they were talking about, because this is exactly how it works. I thought that was a brilliant quote, actually. And these psychology handbooks are really interesting for that, because they give you an insight into the way that the so-called goon squad, 'cause that's what I call them, have been trained. And I'm just going to carry on with another quote, actually, because I'm enjoying these. This is about philosophy and science. It's about known paradigms, characterized by shared theoretical assumptions. Now, this is all the way psychology works, by shared theoretical assumptions. Methods and language are known as a paradigm. It dominates the interpretation of experiments. So a known paradigm or theoretical assumption dominates the interpretation of experiments. Conflicting experimental results are reinterpreted so as to be consistent within the paradigm, and it is only when the conflicting evidence becomes overwhelming that the old paradigm is rejected and a new one introduced. Unfortunately, the notion of a paradigm is not easy to pin down. Some thinkers regard psychology as a science in which a number of different paradigms coexist. Now that's really interesting, because when I've looked into this, the idea of these paradigms, and basically you could use global warming as a perfect example, and 97% of scientists agree, which is absolutely totally untrue, and that's become a paradigm, and people quote it as though it's actually true. A global warming phenomena and the climate change agenda is a perfect example of that, where a paradigm has to be broken. And the thing is that there's so much that's attached to that paradigm, they don't want it to be broken. You can actually see this sort of thing, this attempted Corbyn coup as well, which has been going on basically since he became the leader of the Labour Party. Will this paradigm be smashed? I think there's a very good chance it will be, because you can't just keep banging on about the same thing over and over and over again. And this is exactly what the intelligence services do. And of course, the target, which is us, we have to be receptive to the subversion. Otherwise, subversion can't work. This is the way black magic works, which is a very good point. Now, what I was going to talk about was things like open infiltration and also the media and how that fits in. I mean, we've already discussed how Demos stated that the new democracy would work with a mixture of open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action, i.e. Soros-backed, and fake left groups taking control of the narrative. And also this open infiltration, this became really interesting to me around the time of Occupy. Now, we have talked about this before, but that's where I learned a lot of how subversion works, because it was basically an open gallery of subversion, and you could see how it was being done very, very clearly. And a lot of these groups are like that. If you look at any groups that have taken hold over the years, like the Free Man on the Land movement, what happens is it gets taken over, and basically the people allow subversion to happen within the group. It's a very strange phenomenon that if these people were rooted out to start with, they'd never take hold. But it's amazing how compliant people are, and that's obviously through fear, through political correctness and all the rest of it, which we've covered. Well, around 2009, I started coming across how this infiltration was part of everyday interaction. And it's the reason that the most successful stories are kept under wraps until they're properly formulated, especially now with what I do, because I'll keep something in the background rather than put it out, because the subversion then takes over and you end up having to defend it. And the biggest waste of time, I would say, is having to defend your position when you know you're right. It's extremely draining and extremely tiring. Now, I noticed how this audacity and confidence would be the tool that would take over everything, like complete liars and obvious objects, agents of disinformation, pushed themselves or were pushed into the spotlight. Now, this is where it's interesting, because this is like a whole shadow government. Now, a good way to gain insight into this and develop critical thinking, in my view, is to look at how undercover police operate. Now, there's many examples of this out there. Remember that Mark Stone who was caught out a few years ago, that undercover copper? His unmasking as a fall guy led to him becoming basically a security guard at the Robin Hood holiday park in real, I kid you not. When I was doing some research for a show several years ago, I looked into finding out what had happened to this ex-undercover cop who'd been outed. and he was indeed a security guard at the Robin Hood holiday park in Rhyl. Now, some people may say that is proof that karma exists, but some of the bastions of truth that are state-sponsored subversives are a bit laughable. One of these was supported by members of the even respected alternative media. Now, this story was that he had been an analyst for the police, right? And this is something we covered years ago. And I don't think there's many of our listeners will even be able to remember this, because I think most of our listeners are fairly new. But it was about 5 years ago, and this guy turned up, and he reckoned he was some kind of analyst for the police. And he'd had this amazing revelation that the 7/7 bombings weren't actually done by the perpetrators. So in this moment of revelation, he decided that he would tell his bosses and then basically get sacked because he wasn't doing his job, which was basically to number crunch for the police. So how the two things could actually ever be connected is kind of questionable to start with, and that's a big thing with these disinfo people. Their background narratives often don't make any sense whatsoever, and not the interesting thing is that people don't really even look into it, you know. And so basically, he's had this massive revelation, and what does he do? He makes himself very popular and gets pushed onto all of these alternative media platforms, from things like UFOs to the deadbeat dads, who are basically there to fight the criminality and property theft of the child support agency. And he didn't have a backstory, so they kicked him out. But the funny thing was, and this was a great wake-up call to me about getting involved in any groups and basically going head-to-head with counterintelligence goons. There's no point. You might as well just basically concentrate on what you're doing and ignore them. And recent revelations have proved that these people can be outed, but the actual way that they're outed is often really hard work, and in the end they do out themselves. Now, I remember what happened with this guy. He introduced me to this lady who's clearly got delusional problems, maybe mental illness, and she had this ludicrous story that tied in another story about 7/7, that the 7/7 bombings had been done in some way to shut her up because she wrote some TV program scripts. And it was so ludicrous, right? But the thing is that the fishy tales that he concocted resulted in his promotion of this woman, you see, this guy. And basically, a 2-minute internet search revealed that the story was utterly ridiculous, right? And the poor mastermind behind her being targeted, this woman, and 52 people being killed in London, was to scare her. And it was actually masterminded, the actual 7/7 was masterminded, according to this really funny story, by this musical theatre actor called Richard, who got in touch with me, and he said, I'm the mastermind behind the 7/7 bombings, according to this woman, right? Now, it was so ridiculous, that I backed off and said, no, I can't possibly cover this. And this is the interesting way that counterintelligence works, right? Is what they'll do is if they'll push a story onto you, and if you don't take that story, they'll attack you. And this is a really interesting thing that's happened with Brian Harvey. So he said to someone, he said, oh, mate, you're supporting this bloke who's clearly bent, right? Who's basically a subversive. And I want you to tell me why you're supporting him. So this fella then turns round, the counter-intel goon turns round and goes, you're attacking me. What are you attacking me for? Absolutely classic, that is. I mean, reversal and mirroring is the tactic of choice for the counter-intel goon. And that's a real giveaway when you're up against one, is they will basically, they will accuse you of doing to them what they're doing to you. That's the absolutely classic technique, you know. And so, none of this would be of any consequence, apart from the fact that the more gullible fall for it. In fact, there are more gullible people who call themselves awake than those the same people criticise for being asleep. I'm going into some notes here because I want to stay on topic. But basically, recently this poor woman who thinks that 52 people were killed because she believes she wrote Strictly Come Dancing before she was born, as actually she's attached herself to someone who is actually exposing the counterintelligence agencies, who are themselves gatekeeping abuses and state corruption, and that's someone we're talking about here, and working to subvert opinion by slander and libel. It's always slander and libel, you see. A very important and sad part of what the intelligence services do is to use people with mental illness to attack people, as those suffering delusion are relentless, unhinged, and will constantly attack due to their feelings of paranoia and persecution. And this is the really sad and depressing thing about what they do, is they will use people who are slightly diminished or have mental health issues, and they will actually turn those people on you. And that is what they call intelligence. You know, that's what the intelligence services do. It's really, really a very subversive tactic, that, and probably one of the worst ones, I think, because when you've got someone who's clearly suffering delusions and mental illness, and to use them as an attack dog, it doesn't get any lower than that. And I've seen several examples of that. And also the use of people who are clearly not all there. And this again has come up recently with this story put out by Brian Harvey. If you look into that, it's well worth looking into. But basically, this whole narrative that's been built up again about this Tommy Robinson character is extraordinary, and it goes to show that the intelligence services are actually catering for the mentality that is out there. So in other words, there's no point them doing anything too intelligent, because it's going to go over people's heads. I mean, that's sad but true. You know, let's have a look at what's in chat. Oh, you're talking about one of them, yeah. Now, it's interesting you mention him, because this person is someone that I wouldn't engage with. I've known from day one was incredibly dodgy, and I've stayed in the background and watched what's happened. And what does happen with all of these people is there comes a time when they are outed, or they basically out themselves, and that can only be a good thing. And that does tend to happen, but they leave behind them an awful lot of damage. But what if the public actually supported real travesties of justice? This is my point, actually. I wanted to make this point tonight. This is something that I really do feel strongly about, and I think most people who listen to the show would as well. That basically there's these terrible travesties of justice going on. 55.5% of cases by the HMIC Inspectorate and the CPS Inspectorate were found to have vital defence evidence basically buried. And I've had experience of that. Anyone who listens to the show, listen to our Kent crime farming shows. I mean, the sad thing is that none of this is going to get out there unless the police actually roll over and say they've done something wrong, which is very unlikely. But we covered the story of this fellow, Raj Mahay, and his mother, Kishni Mahay, basically whose manslaughter by West Midlands police and the treatment of her son Raj are beyond what the public would actually believe. And the sad thing about that show is I put it out on a Wednesday. It was a special, and it's had probably about 800 views. And this is the really annoying thing about it, that stories which are absolutely tragic and have destroyed people's lives are completely ignored by the public. And that's something that is known by the intelligence services. They know pretty much that the public won't really look into things. They prefer very trivial information. So the reason that these simplistic psychological operations work is that the perpetrators know their target audience quite well. Isn't that just the truth? Now, the taking over of groups is just this thing I wanted to talk about, and we have covered it over the years. Most recently, I've talked about things like the People's Assembly and how that was set up. That's quite an interesting one, actually. And previous to that, Occupy, the Soros and World Bank sponsored Women's March. That was another one that was good to look at. We did a thing about that. That was in London in 2017. And that was absolutely fascinating, because that was actually an event which the participants in didn't understand or know why they were actually there. Now, that is very worrying, because none of them knew what they were protesting about. They came out with sound bites, but none of them could define what the actual event was about, because it wasn't anything to do with International Women's Day. It was hijacked by the European Bank. And just to look at the website, you could see it was also being pushed by corporations who were pushing an extreme ideological subversion in the respect of political correctness. So, yeah, basically the thing is with the People's Assembly is it's there to corral people and basically to give them their day out. They have their day of protest and nothing happens afterwards. It's called controlling the narrative, and it happens in every single kind of organised protest there is. And people still go on them, people still march. They like to think they've had their voices heard, but they are the biggest distraction going. And I found that out with the People's Assembly especially. I was a couple of years ago doing some research for a show, and I found out exactly how all this works. And the chap who was behind it all, he was doing his Alex Jones thing with a megaphone, and he did a training day for the People's Assembly, which was getting 3,000 people into the centre of London for no reason whatsoever to complain about corruption. Corruption, that's a bit broad, isn't it? And basically, he then took charge of that, and he's looking after the public interest. That's what he's doing. Good luck to him. He's actually giving people a day out, and he's protecting them. So there's no problem with that. It's just that the public think things work in a way that there's some kind of democratic thought process going on here. However, I'll just make some notes here. However, well-intentioned speakers. Now, this is the thing, that the speakers that think these things are well-intentioned, but it's all, the narrative is all controlled. Now, one of the more positive aspects of the People's Assembly is that the public outed Russell Brand and his idea of, revolution. The MI5 intelligence services idea of revolution, that is, of course. Now, one of my first ever shows was called Infiltration Special, and the guests all shared their experiences of group infiltration, and that's in tonight's the thing I posted up there. It's on Windows on the World, and it's called Police State Harassment Exposed, and I'm going to get into a few stories on that because they're really, really interesting. Now, one of the main distinguishing factors of a subversive is that they use psychological mirroring. That's what I was talking about earlier on. They accuse you of doing to them what they are doing to you. That is one of the most basic things. They all do it, and it's actually the manipulation of a psychopath. That's what psychopaths do. They will do that to you. They will accuse you of doing to them what they are doing to you. And I've had absolute direct experience of that, and it's very, very dangerous. It's a real trick that psychopaths use, which the intelligence services use all the time. Now, yes, so this counterintelligence operation that's been exposed recently is very, very interesting, because it's actually uncovered something which hopefully will have to disappear. There will be new agents brought in, but I think that this is quite a defining moment in some ways, because I've been involved in this for years, and this has never actually happened before on this level. One of the reasons that I don't name these people anymore or get involved with them directly in any confrontation, as I said, is because the shows are going really well now. We're putting out absolutely spot-on information, and there's no infiltration going on at all. Nobody can touch it. They can try and have a go at it, and I don't get that many people doing that anymore, because they know that this is another thing, that unless you actually interact with these people, often they will leave you alone, which is another thing which brings it into line with black magic. This is a very important point. And one that I can't stress enough is that often these subversives will not actually respond to you unless you start to engage with them. And that's the really interesting thing, because there's some of them that have been named recently, who I never engaged with. I knew who they were, and I even told one of them to his face exactly what I thought of him. And that was a long time ago. But they've never been able to touch what I do, because I don't engage with them, and it's a much better policy, I think. Now, basically, with a bit of practice, these people become incredibly easy to spot, and they appear from nowhere and get a lot of publicity. And that's the interesting thing about it. Whenever someone appears from nowhere, they're always a wrong 'un. Always. I mean, you can tell that the figures on YouTube are vastly manipulated. And I've become very aware of this recently because as we've gone out on Spreaker, and please do subscribe to us on Spreaker, everybody, because that's where it's at, because our YouTube channel's already been threatened. But the figures on Spreaker are higher than on YouTube. Now, that's highly unlikely when you consider the size of the YouTube platform. And I've noticed this with certain subjects that we cover. Now, basically, when these fake stories get circulated, they have no backup story which stands up to scrutiny. They parrot cliches and do not have any detail, and also they latch the public onto stories which have no plausible backstory. Now, this is really, really a good point, I think. Now, one organisation who still promote these stories were also the only people allowed to organise and facilitate the so-called Bilderberg protest event in Watford, which was paid for by Goldman Sachs. Now, I know this because I went up there and I talked to Hertfordshire Police, and the police said to me, it's very strange, this event. They said, it's being funded, we're being paid by Goldman Sachs to give you guys a chance to protest in a closed field. So they basically had cameras up so they knew everyone who'd gone in, and that's how it works. It was a great surveillance exercise, and it was also a photo op for Alex Jones, and it also promoted was a fantasist who was meant to be missing. Yeah, there's a fantasist who was promoted by this agency, this group, who were given free rein as the agents of the protest, and they were the only people allowed to stay in the protest field. And there was this person who was actually there who had been reported missing on their website. Now, it didn't say go to the police, it said actually call us if you see him, but he was there in their tent. And I actually spoke to this person who's actually a pathological liar, and I told him to his face he was a pathological liar. And then I found out that the lady who had been pushed onto us with this fake story, the one who thinks Strictly Come Dancing was the reason for the 7/7 bombings, was actually still being promoted by these people. So what's interesting is that this counterintelligence stuff, they'll tell the public 70% of what they want. Now, this is a great point about it, is that they tell you stuff that you can already find out. And then what they do is they put in this distraction stuff, like they'll get you to follow some fake story where there's a fake court case. And a lot of these court cases aren't real. And I know that because I used to go outside the Royal Courts of Justice. And when I actually looked into the real stories of what happened with these cases, there was no actual evidence. And that really shocked me at first, because I thought I was dealing with people who knew what they were talking about and had researched things like I do. I just assumed that they did the same thing, and no, they don't. And several of those names, there's certain that I actually block on social media because they're just dangerous. They will start tagging you into things, and all of a sudden you'll become associated with something dodgy. And that's why I'm kind of very careful about this stuff now. But basically, yeah, it's absolutely amazing, this stuff, because I heard recently a friend of mine who I saw the other day told me that this person who'd attacked me on a website a few years ago had turned up at his house, and they gave him a lift to the Bilderberg protest, and he was absolutely paralytic drunk, managed to get himself arrested. 2 hours later, he was in a suit, completely sober, and he was in the Goldman Sachs protest field. Now, that person who laid these attacks on me and several others was operating from a website, and I'm going to go into the story of it because it's such a good story, and it outlines this stuff in some detail. Now, what happened was, I was outside the Royal Courts of Justice, and I was approached by this fella, and he said, I've looked at your website, I've got problems with bailiffs, I keep getting my car clamped. I said, we've got plenty of solutions to that on the website. He said, I know, and I really like what you're doing, I think it's great, because you're one step ahead of other people. He was trying to butter me up, I suppose, but basically he knew that I wasn't a pushover. So what happened was, we decided to meet up with this chap, yeah? And he turned up at our monthly meet-up in a pub. And he came along with his friend, and we went to this drinking club later, and we were chatting away, and I wasn't altogether sure about this fella. And his friend told a friend of mine that he'd worked in French military intelligence. Fair enough, so what, really? We never saw them again. And then this website and the person I've just talked about, he actually started to carry on with this subversion, going on and on and on this website, inciting real hatred against me and several others. So I looked up who owned the website, and I found it was owned by this company. And I looked at the managing directors of the company, of the website, which owned the website that had been inciting hatred against me and others. And guess who it was? It was the two fellas who we'd been out for a drink with. Well, who would have thought, eh? Who would have thought? So if you have a look on that article, Police State Harassment Exposed, and scroll down, I wouldn't advise you reading all of it, but just flick through it. You will see the names of these people and the company on there. Now, what was interesting was this fella was actually running a company which supplied VoIP phones, voice over internet protocol phones, for companies. Now, I think he was clearly working for the intelligence services. And when you think about it, what a brilliant idea. So you set up VoIP phones which are private within a company. They're on a restricted server, and you've got access to them for the government. I suppose that's good business sense for him. But basically what happened was I wrote him 3 emails stating that I'd been libelled on this website which he owned, and there was no answer. But you can look at his name and it's on there. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is there's a lot of these template websites, probably not as many as there used to be actually, which contain links to real stories, and they're all cut and pasted on a variety of sort of conspiracy topics at police and government agencies, and set up to get details of researchers and journalists. Basically, you sign up to get their newsletters and all the rest of it. They're just phishing exercises. Now, these sites are just gatekeeper sites, and they want to corral information. But there's some really funny aspects to this, because when I've started linking things together, right, it's really, really funny. And yes, Martin, yeah, you're right. It was him that was missing, this person who I mentioned, and he's now working as a barman in Somerset. We went into a pub a few weeks ago, and he was there. I think that he did recognise me, but I don't engage with these people. It's not really worth it. But yes, interesting that was very interesting, and there's a lot more to that story, and you'll find it in that article. But basically, this whole thing is very interesting when you start really looking into it. So that particular example taught me a lot, because I found out that this is the norm. I think it's the norm. I don't think it's the exception. I think that because of the improvement in all this and this data mapping, I mean, nothing's going to be private anymore anyway. That's the whole point of this show, that nothing is ever going to be private again. You're never going to have your information kept with any privacy. It's impossible now, especially what's coming in with this 5G agenda. And I was phoned up the other day by Mark Steele, and he's doing some talks all over the place, and I want to get him to post our interview that we did with him on his website, because it's not up there and it's got a lot of links on. But he's doing quite a lot of talks about this 5G, and yeah, it is the active denial system. It's the same technology, and of course the 28 gigahertz range. Reading about it, you would think, my God, they couldn't possibly get away with this. Well, they can, and obviously they think they are going to. The big they. But there's something else that's quite interesting that's embedded into that article, is the Joint Threat Risk Intelligence Group slideshow with the 4Ds: deny, disrupt, degrade and deceive, or as the Army use it, deny, disrupt, degrade and destroy. Now, this slideshow describes how cyber magicians are wanted to wage war on the internet, and that is the public that are waging war on us, the public, by the way. And as the army captain stated when talking about the 7-7 Brigade, this lot in Berkshire trolling everyone on Facebook, and we've talked about that, you can have a look at that actual show. It's linked to that article. It's a short thing about 7-7 Brigade, UK's Facebook army trolls, I think it's called. And when asked whether this was a psychological operation against the public, the army captain said, well, no, and yes, which was a perfect counterintelligence answer. It's really hilarious. I thought that was fantastic, that he did that. And very, very amusing. There is a highly amusing aspect to this in that these people are basically bunglers, and the thing is, though, on the ground, I saw how nasty it got, because that guy Brian Hoare in Parliament Square, he was kind of attacked by these really vile subversives. I mean, he was really ill, and they'd be screaming in his face. And we met this fella there one night, and he reckoned that because he'd had affiliations with people in the intelligence services and MI5 had been following him around for a long time, he reckoned, this is really sinister, that they were actually injecting him. He was an alcoholic, and he said they were injecting him through his tent to rehydrate him and keep him alive, because they wanted at some point to actually make sure that they got the information out of him. So this stuff, I think, does work on very sinister levels. And ironically, this is a funny one actually, the Russian embassy are still tweeting that they would like some evidence that Russia had anything to do with the Skripal poisoning. So they're actually putting it on Twitter and asking the British government to respond to them, which is hilarious, I think. It's absolutely hilarious, because that story is ludicrous. Yeah, that's right. Let's have a look what's in chat. Yeah, Martin says the sort of protest the People's Assembly ran just had cheap coach trips to bring people to London, have a shout and then go home again. Yeah, but what I was saying about that, Martin, is that the chap who organised it actually came up to the People's Voice, and he was the most obvious sort of plant, really. And he's actually attached to other people who've tried to get me linked into subversive stories. Now, recently, a friend of mine contacted me and says, oh, you have to talk to this guy, Mark. He knows such a lot, and my heart sank. I thought, oh, no. I mean, this is really retarded stuff, with no evidence to back it up, making huge allegations and causing the maximum amount of trouble possible. And this guy even phoned me up. I asked him to send me the evidence, and he said, evidence? I've got evidence coming out of my ears. How much do you want? I said, well, whatever you've got. Never heard from him again. Never heard from him again. Yeah. It's a very funny thing, that. But yeah, it's worth looking at that slideshow, even if some of it may be mocked up. I think the actual main thrust of it is absolutely true, because if you look at Joint Threat Risk Intelligence Group on the internet, you'll find out what they do. And that is really subversive stuff. But is it any more subversive than what's happening to the public on a daily basis? No, it's not really. It's not any more subversive than Emily Maitlis at the BBC. It's not any more idiotically subversive than Kay Burley at Sky. They're all subversives in their own way. And I would say the BBC are probably worse. I mean, the Sky News Journalist of the Year is pretty laughable, really, and a bit sad. But the point is that she suffers from extraordinarily high esteem. And you just think, well, this is what useful idiots are made of, isn't it? But I remember years ago, there's this community group was set up by this particularly comedic ex-copper. Now, this copper, he looked like something out of the Sweeney. And basically, he had the jargon of someone out of the Sweeney. And you can imagine him saying, look, sunshine, your mate squealed. Yeah, he's in the next cell. You're looking at 5 years. Are you going to talk or what? You can just tell. And he just talked like that all the time, It's incredibly funny, right? And apparently, he set up this community group, but he turned up down at my friend's pub where she had a meeting, truth meeting, yeah? And him and this other copper turned up, yeah? And they dressed up and they bought fancy dress clothes to make themselves look like hippies. Now, this stuff, you just couldn't make it up how stupid these people are. I mean, the other thing is as well about these lot is, right, it says, oh yes, I'm an ex-policeman, I'm a whistleblower. Well, who's paying your pension then? How come you can go to all these events, How come you can go to every alternative event from New Age ceremonies to things on common law, It's really, really funny, the whole thing. But these people do cause a lot of trouble. But anyway, he did this presentation, this copy, and I filmed it, and it's one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And everything he did was like a police interrogation out of the Sweeney. I mean, these people just can't help it, I mean, it was one of the most comedic examples of a cliche-ridden 70s copper that you could possibly imagine, yeah. And he actually wrote an article about me, and he said, mark my words, it doesn't take MI5 to see through windows. And basically, it was just this nonsense article. But it had all these keywords in, which basically linked me and David Icke into dodgy things. I said, you've got to take all that out. And he did, right? But then I wrote back a response to that, and it's gone now, because it's on this website called Land of the Free, which unfortunately we lost. I knew someone who was running it for me, and he lost the website. It's not there anymore, but I've still got these articles, and they are incredibly funny. But the reason I don't engage with this stuff anymore is because there's no real point, There's actually no point in doing it. So I think I might actually stay on for the second hour tonight, because I was going to do a 1 hour show, but that's actually, I think that's gone out of the window because I've got so much more to get through. So we'll have a break, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Going to have a bit of Midnight G Mix from IJ Chris.
Disappointment no more. Oh, you crazy. No, my brain can't take it no more. Try everything to make it happen, but my whole life remains the same. Who's to be blamed? Another midnight today. Me alone left in the dark again. Another midnight today. Me alone left in the dark again. Oh, I'm alone and so cold. Just wishing my baby would come over. Oh, I'm alone and so cold. Just wishing my baby would come over.
Alright then, so me know she never true to the thing, so she love the boss in the bin. Make her for the platinum and gold for the ring, for the dollar, she don't really matter who she giving. Our body, our hobby, dilly daddy run the alley. Link up Sean and Jerome and Johnny if Sammy. No have no money, then sorry. She did love me, but she said me and nobody. Hustle and she grind well up to the time, so she love a man with kind, well neat and refined. Play with me like good thing, me no blind. Most I show me a sign. Girl, you love worse than the cry. Yeah, yeah. No, no, no. Ooh, yeah, yeah.
wishing my baby would come over. Oh, I'm all alone and so cold. I can't take it, baby. Oh, I'm all alone and so cold. I can't take it, no, can't take it.
Welcome back to Windows on the World. That's IJ Chris, Midnight G-Mix, and you can find Chris's music at Coffee and Cream. It's KOFFEANKREEM. And you can download his tracks and spread the word about what he's doing. So I've just had a call from Piers Corbyn in the break, and we're trying to connect him, but the reception isn't too good. I was actually going to be giving a talk with Sandy Adams, our talk, The Bigger Picture, up in... here he is again. I'll just see if we can get through. Hello, Mr. Corbyn.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We're back on, but I think it's a bad line, isn't it?
It's a bad line, but we can hear you. So how's things going down there?
Well, you better ring me though, because this is going to be very expensive for me, because it's...
All right, then. Well, you're actually live on air, so I'll call you straight back. So that's Mr. Corbyn there. I've got to phone him back because he's on the other end of the phone. Yeah, he just called me in the break, so we may as well catch up with the latest news from Weather Action. I'll just give him a quick call back. It's very spontaneous, this tonight. I was actually going to do an hour show, but I've decided to stay on. I actually quite enjoy it, so this is spontaneity for you. Spontaneity.
Hello?
Good evening.
This is a better line.
That's a
Good
better...
evening, Mr. Windows.
Good
I'm here
evening.
with Nick Colston and various floppers.
Okay, so
Steve Parker.
how are things in sunny Norfolk?
Well, it's brilliant weather. Getting here was a big blow, and it proves that railways must be nationalised immediately. The talk I gave went down well. It was the stuff about the fiction of man-made climate change and a bit of the new ideas in electric universe, and how the carbon dioxide ideology is used as a battering ram by the ruling circles to coerce people.
Well, that's
and
good
the
news.
idea of consensus, everything is just a nonsense. This obsession on consensus being right is, of course, a way of regimenting everybody, more so than they've ever been in the past, I think.
Well, that's absolutely right, and that was the subject of tonight's show in a way, because I started out with this psychological interpretation of consensus and what it actually is.
Right.
In other words, that in psychology, they're talking about the way that paradigms are created, and those paradigms can only be broken by people who actually go against the paradigm. And the idea is that we're being shut down because we're against the paradigm, but we happen to be right because we've done our research. Well, that's my opinion. What's your opinion?
Well, I agree with that completely. You see, because, when I was talking, sorry, I almost trod on Nick's foot there. the people are saying, well, expert opinion is this or that. So I just said, well, look, there were experts around at the time of the phlogiston theory of chemistry, and there's always experts around in any theory, but all theories come to an end,
Exactly.
So the idea that consensus is a guide of what's correct is a complete falsity.
Well, this time last
Yeah.
year, this time last year, we were sat there in deck chairs talking about being banned from the Green Gathering.
That's right.
Yeah,
that was raised again. Jonathan mentioned that, how appalling it was that we were banned from the Green Gathering.
Exactly. So the line's not too good, Mr. Corbyn, so we might have to keep this fairly short, but what's the attendance like there? Did you manage to get your points across, and did you have a Q&A?
Yeah, we did have a Q&A with Nick and Jonathan and me. We went over stuff which is usual things about evidence for the CO2 stuff and why it fails. And I brought in some new things from Electric Universe, which are very interesting, namely that this recent very active period of storms, which is the 28th of July to the 1st of August, which included 360,000 lightning strikes in Europe. This period, although it was predicted by us, did not, and had the weather we predicted, did not include a lot of activity in the solar wind. So it was just like something very abnormal going on. And what I'm concluding is that actually there are 5 periods where there are red weather periods, as we call them, are also driven not just by solar wind things, but by Birkeland currents. These are electrical currents that you can't see, joining up the sun and the earth. And what I'm thinking is that these are a very big part of sun-earth relations, which is up to now being completely ignored.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd actually recommend that people look at Thunderbolts of the Gods on YouTube for more on Birkeland currents. That's a really good film. Probably a lot of our listeners have already looked at it, I would think. But we also did a show on Electric Universe with yourself and Steve Pank. That's available in the archive. So
absolutely.
Next week we shall be at a secret location doing some talks in Pembrokeshire. And if anyone wants to come along, email me through the website. And the week after, we're going to be at Sunrise. That's the 17th of August. And we're going to be speaking on Saturday, a week Saturday, at the Sunrise Festival. And it's going to be The Bigger Picture. And the Sunrise Festival is in Monmouth. So have a look on the website. And if you fancy going, we'd like to see you down there. Well, thanks for coming on, Piers.
Thank you. No, pleasure's mine. And I'll be seeing you at some or all of those festivals, depending on, because I'm doing the Sunday at the Sunrise, because of transport issues and stuff I've got to do on the Saturday. Okay. Anyway, all the best, and goodbye.
Okay. Cheers then.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye. There you go. It's spontaneous there. That's Piers Corbyn live from Norfolk. And yeah, that's interesting what he was saying there about the consensus, the manufactured consensus which people repeat automatically and in a very Pavlovian way. And that quote from the beginning of the show made absolute sense when I put it into context with what he'd said. He's saying the same thing, that people are saying, but 97% of scientists agree. 4 out of 5 cats prefer this. It's the same thing. It's also, remember that one, good and bad cholesterol? Well, watch our show Statin Nation and find out what that's all about. Good and bad cholesterol. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as bad cholesterol. There is cholesterol, and this was propounded by someone called Ansel Keys in the 1950s. And they basically wanted people to stop eating fat. And that's why this graph was done. It's a bit like the hockey stick graph, same thing. In fact, I was thinking about this earlier today. When I look at the newspapers and mainstream media, pretty much everything they say is the opposite. So if you just reverse what they say, you get to the truth. Reversal, it does work, you see. There was another good article actually about recycling. I was actually mentioning this to somebody because I'm in a part of the country where people are very slavish about recycling, and it's totally pushed by the council as being a completely environmental and duty-bound obligation of every citizen. And they give you these ridiculous little boxes that you have to put everything in, and they're tiny, you know, they're basically getting people to throw away as little as possible, but what they're going to do with the rest of it. And then we find out on the Daily Mail this week, yes, 2/3 of it goes to landfill. And it's already been found out before, but basically they're saying it's like a mafia operation in Eastern Europe, you know. Very, very funny. So that's the thing. It's all about deception, really, isn't it? So, yeah. But there is a hugely comedic side into all this counterintelligence stuff, and it's like the general inefficiency of it, you know. And as I was talking about this copper now, it's so funny how you get these ex-police turning up in the alternative media, isn't it? The ex-police whistleblowers, you know. And that's a great thing recently that they're being found out. But I just thought I'd share with you tonight some of these experiences that I'd had, because when I look back at that article today, it kind of made me chuckle a bit, because we actually got rid of one of these goons with 160 fish jokes on Facebook. Now, these days, that would probably be banned as hate speak for calling somebody, basically using different types of crustacean and seafood to describe somebody. But the truth is that a good percentage of human activity is useless, and that's the very sad thing. So we need to cut down the amount of attention that we put into useless activity. And responding to a lot of this stuff is useless activity. I do quite enjoy it on Twitter, though, because you can actually have a go at people in a rather comedic way and call them out. And in the hope, really, that they're going to see what you've tweeted. But the shadow banning may be a reason why I don't get very many responses to my tweets, actually. It might also be a reason why Waltham Forest Council haven't banned me on Twitter yet. Yeah. Well, Anonymous7457 is talking about direct energy weapons. Now, this is an interesting thing, and this also ties into the 5G agenda, because basically phased array is a directed energy weapon, and the phased array system is what 5G is using, the active denial system. Look up that one. But when we talk about directed energy weapons, it's a rather loose term and not something that I know much about. But the California fires, that is very, very anomalous what is going on there in California. And Deborah Tavares has put some great stuff out. Stop the Crime New on YouTube. That's Stop the Crime New. Deborah has a website called stopthecrime.net, and she's been putting out information for years. She had a bit of a break from it a while ago, but she's back again now. And looking at the aerial photography that's going on over there, it is quite clear that something is happening which is not normal, and there are alleged laser beams being spotted. It's hard to tell. We need to get experts in on this, really. But Martin's saying people need to all move to a simpler system like IRC where they can't ban. Right, yeah. So you would know about that, Martin. I think you should be our technical advisor on how to go forward, because I use Linux on one of my computers, but on the other one I don't. So I actually broadcast on a Windows computer because I can't get Spreaker on Ubuntu. It won't work on Ubuntu, I don't think. So if Martin, if you've got any suggestions on how I can get Spreaker to work on Ubuntu, if you've got 5 minutes and you've got nothing better to do, do have a look and see if you can find anything. But basically, the simple truth is that it's best to disengage from these fake truth circus freaks, and it ends up eating into time, which I've just been over that point. And basically, yeah, I just made some notes on all this because that article I wrote years ago, that police state harassment exposed, it brought back so many memories of when we were going head to head with these people, and a lot of it was fun. But I just realised that we were probably wasting our time. Martin said I had it working years ago. Oh, that's great then. Well, we'll chat about that, Martin. That's really good. But basically, we've even got things like the War on Terror, which was predicted in 1969 by Dr. Richard Day. I mean, if you haven't seen those shows, Social Engineers Now and Then, and Social Engineers Creating Confusion, have a look at them, because it's absolutely amazing that even the prediction that people would be jogging and wearing training shoes was made in 1969. They said people would just be running everywhere. And yes, it's all happened. But when I was looking at some of that stuff earlier today, this whole War on Terror narrative was predicted in 1969, in an off-the-cuff speech made by this Dr. Richard Day at Mount Sinai Hospital to a load of medical students, I believe. I've actually got it in here somewhere. I've got the detail of it. It's absolutely fascinating, that. And that's something that David Icke talks about a lot. He talks about this. And basically they said terrorism would be used widely. It could become necessary if the US did not move rapidly enough into the system, which is, of course, PNAP, the Project for the New American Century. It's stated in there that absent some catastrophe like a new Pearl Harbor, it would be very difficult to get the American people to go to war. And that was a defining document, and also one which, well, it's an up-to-date version of this stuff that Dr. Richard Day was talking about in 1969. Quite incredible when you look at some of those predictions. And basically the war on guns in America, gun control, and this David Hogg, ironically, he was protected by armed security guards at a protest, which is kind of ironic because he's actually advocating absolute gun control and the banning of guns. But it's incredible that these people turn up, and he's straight out of Central Casting, and so is that other one. I don't know whether you remember, the one who's the South American girl with a shaved head. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's just like Hollywood movie stuff. The actual casting is so obvious that it becomes too cliched to be real, doesn't it? So basically, yeah, infinite inflation was another thing that they predicted. And basically, the microchipping, it's all in there. And I would actually suggest that people really do have a look at that, because there is absolute proof in that article and those recordings from 1969 that all of this was absolutely predicted. Even like private housing would become obsolete, housing would become unaffordable, absolutely unaffordable, So large homes would be taken by taxes and regulation. It's exactly what's happening. But also what's happening is these private insolvency companies. I'm getting more and more people sending me stuff about these private insolvency companies. It's absolutely terrible. That this is allowed to go on. That this looting 1, 2. Oh, right. I hope I'm back on air. My microphone's actually crashed again. Am I back on air? I will just put it in the chat box. Am I back? Am I back on air? Can anybody hear me out there? Okay, yes. No sound, no sound. I've just been told. Okay. I don't think that we're broadcasting. Yes, you can hear me. Oh, that's a real shame. I'm going to have to do something about this, everybody, because basically, yes, I was talking about what was happening with this Anthony John Hill case and how that revealed to me what was going on with these sort of low-level intelligence goons. It was basically this fellow who made this film Ripple Effect, and the people who were involved around that and the attention that it caused was quite interesting. So yes, I think people can hear me now, but yeah, basically my microphone has crashed again and I'm having this problem which is recurring, so I'm going to have to do something about it. It's very, very annoying. Yes, I was talking to myself for a few minutes there, which is okay, right. I think I might have to wrap the show. Okay, so you can't hear me. I'll just see. Okay, can you hear me now? Can anybody out there hear? Yes, fine now. Yes, fine. That's good. Yeah, I'm just. This is actually the problems of being in a place where maybe the internet signal keeps crashing, because I've had this several times now. I'm going to have to do something about it. I might end up having to just tether myself to the microphone. Yeah. Well, let's carry on with this stuff anyway, with the perception, the gambits for deception, repackage and reinvent, modify old clues, create new cues, modify old cues and create new cues, repackage and invent. Well, they're not very good at that, if you ask me. The intelligence services are really bad at that. Dazzle and decoy. Now that's another one. You get people who distract. The distraction principles are a really interesting thing, I think. That's why I like talking about this stuff, because I remember years ago when the Bank of Ideas, this fake squat in the City of London, which was set up, you can see our shows on our Inside Occupying the Bank of Ideas. This fake squat was set up, and basically I told the police that this bailiff had run over this woman with his car, and he was sort of trapped in the middle of the crowd, and this agent provocateur stole what I'd said and used it to get himself on the news, which was quite clever really, because it made him look like the hero. And this stuff is funny. It's kind of, they're very audacious, these people, but they're pretty obvious. And this really ties into what's going on at the moment with what's been revealed over the past few weeks that people in chat are talking about. But basically, it carries on, make the cue dynamic. Well, that's what they do. Yeah, they want to steal the attention, and people will go where their attention is led. That's basically the misdirection principle. That's why they look for cyber magicians, you know. Stimulate multiple senses. This is a really interesting thing, right? What these agents tend to do, and it doesn't matter who they're working for, is that they will throw in loads of things for you to get distracted about. So they'll distract you with one issue and then bring in counter issues. That's a huge part of it, which is why isolating an issue is really important. Like, I think the isolation of issues is one of the most important things to do. Another thing that says down here is sense making. Sense making is one of the sections. It says exploit prior beliefs. So in other words, yes, tell people what they want to hear. Now this is the absolute classic of these counterintelligence people who work in the so-called truth community. What they do is they tell you what you want to hear. Everybody wants to feel positive about something, and all of the negative stuff that they'll give out is the stuff that's already in the public domain, the stuff that you can look up for yourself. So what they do is they introduce these new narratives. That's a really big part of it. And repetition creates expectancies. Yeah, repetition creates expectancies. So that's a thing that's used all the time. Now, swap the real for the false and vice versa. This is really subversive stuff. I mean, swapping the real for the false is really a big part of this as well. Basically leading you down the garden path, which is
very apparent with a lot of these court cases and these people who get promoted, and they get promoted that, oh, they've been put in prison and it's wrong and it's this and it's that and it's that. I don't want to go back to Tommy Robbins again, but that's an example. But there's other examples that are being promoted right now, and the great tragedy of all this is that the real cases do not get heard. The people who are actually in prison who shouldn't be have not got a voice. So that's something that I think is really important and something I try and push forward, because that's where I think shows like this can have an effect, and they have had an effect. We have won several court cases over the years, and I've managed to highlight things. Obviously, the bringing down of Crime Stoppers is a big thing, but most people who know the show will know about that, so I won't go on about that too much. But let's carry on with this. Affect, how things are affected. This is a major one. Create cognitive stress, which is all part of the stimulate multiple senses agenda. Basically, I've seen this done to people, and it's really, really effective. It's absolutely satanic way of behaving, but this is exactly what they do. They create cognitive stress. So they basically make you into somebody who is constantly having to defend themselves, and that's why a lot of victims of this start to get paranoid. And this is the interesting thing, that you have to be able to look at who's actually genuinely been traumatized and who's unhinged. And this is where it starts to cross over into what I was talking about earlier on with that lady who thinks the 7/7 bombings were done to shut her up, and to this day thinks I'm part of some new world order, you know. I mean, she's a victim and they're just using her, but also she's part of it because she chooses to be. She actually chooses to be. She's a narcissist, and narcissists get used all the time in this. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing. Create psychological stress and physiological stress. Now, this is an interesting thing because post-traumatic stress disorder is something that I didn't really know much about, but I've actually had experience of it, and now I know what it is. And it's something that's actually in the body, and it's a very interesting thing, this, because if you haven't had it, you wouldn't know about it, because loads of people get stressed out, and that stress is usually dissipated. It's when stress can't be dissipated, but it's constant, and that's one of the things that the intelligence services and these goons do, is they put people under constant stress, and this eventually does make them look mad and paranoid. So when looking at this, yeah, you just have to be really, really kind of critical in your analysis, and that's why I brought this up, and why I hope people who listen to this show are interested in this and don't think it's sort of a waste of time, because I think it's one of the most crucial things going, actually. I just want to see that I'm still broadcasting. I think I am. Yes. You pulled a jack plug out. Yeah, I did actually, but the reason I pulled it out is because the microphone's jammed. It's actually jammed. So in other words, it's the input of the microphone is the input levels are jammed, they're not moving, but I'm using a different one now, which is the computer one, which is not as good. However, let's not get distracted onto side issues. But yeah, create physiological stress. This is through post-traumatic stress disorder, which they actually induce into people, which, I mean, is something that the public wouldn't think would happen. I don't think the general public know how subversive this stuff is. Create effective stress. Exploit shared effect. So basically that means that the groups of people start attacking, and that's what happened to me years ago. It doesn't happen anymore, but it wouldn't happen anymore because I know how it works, and if anything like that arises, you just brush it aside and get on with something else. The last category here is called behavior. Simulate the action, simulate the outcome, time shift perceived behavior. This is all kind of intelligence gobbledygook to me, but divorce behavior from outcome. This is again what would cause cognitive stress. Channel behavior. So basically this stuff is all about psychology. It's about using psychology, and that's why I found that really interesting to look into the use of psychology against the public and what psychology actually is. That's why it's a huge part of the shows. And when I've looked through all of this stuff and got involved in this research over the years, I found it all leads into this stuff. It all leads into psychology, which is quite interesting because psychology is not something that I think is overall that effective, because the target has to be receptive to the subversion. And looking through my notes on this stuff, I just find I've got books with stuff in, and I looked at something called Schneiderman's failings, and it's how suicides happen. After all, it says suicide is the desire to reduce painful tensions by stopping the unbearable flow of consciousness when consciousness has become interrupted with this stuff, basically where people are being manipulated. Consciousness is pure awareness though, and that's not in their strategy. But once people get sucked into this, and a good friend of mine's been really sucked into it recently, it's affected her health tremendously. I mean, this is how evil these people are. There's a woman with a heart condition, and they're inducing more and more stress on her. The public don't really realise how this stuff works, and that emotions are not consciousness. This is a really important thing, a really important tool in the armoury against all this. Emotions are not consciousness. They're an internalised memory from a point of view which could be influenced by previous self-doubt and hatred. And this is a big thing that they do. They look for the weak points, exploit the weak points, and your psychopaths do this all the time. I was working with someone who turned out to be a psychopath a few years ago, and they always exploit weak points, what they perceive to be weak points, and things that you hadn't even considered that anyone would bring up. And that's part of the sinister objectives of the so-called intelligence services. And basically, they traumatise people until they kill themselves. Suicide is an action to put an end to intolerable emotions. So this is all the sort of stuff that I've been talking about that links in. Basically, my idea as a way of countering a lot of this stuff is to create unpredictability. I found this really interesting, actually, that when I acted completely unpredictably, these people are absolutely shocked. And I've done it a few times. And I think it's a great strategy for people to use. So always do something that's completely unpredictable, that they're not expecting. It's great fun as well. Basically, yeah, and I'd say create societies. This is something I've been talking about for ages, but they keep them under the radar, But creativity is something that is not factored in, and you'll see that with these Soros-created groups. There's no creativity in this stuff at all. In this subversion, absolutely no. It's nil creativity. They are not able to be fluid in their movements and thoughts at all. Basically, rejecting the media is the only way out with this stuff, and actually being able to start critical thinking again. The only remedy against propaganda and the corruption of reality is honesty, clarity, and natural law. I keep coming back to that natural law thing because I studied it and I found it to be the actual antithesis of what is being imposed through the media and through this psychological subversion. So yeah, like the funded fake liberalism is the recruitment arm for the police state. Basically, that's all it is. So we've got the opinion corridor. No one's allowed outside it. But I think it's starting to backfire now, which is why I've done this show tonight, to bring up a lot of this stuff from the past and kind of put it in context. Because when I looked through that article, it just brought back these memories. And thought, well, it's actually quite interesting because all of these people that I was talking about years ago have disappeared, with exceptions of a few who are about to disappear, and they are about to disappear if they've not disappeared already. So the interesting thing is going to be who's going to replace them. Who's going to be the next fake guru who comes up. There's got to be one, and they are getting more and more easy to spot. So I want this to become part of the fun of basically being a citizen journalist, Yeah, but the warfare of psychology is waged under the banner of equity, liberty and fraternity, or diversity, empowerment, or social justice, which means the opposite. The outside destruction of borders is the ultimate goal, as it is the theft of land rights. That's the most important thing with all this stuff. We're just talking about massive land theft and the stealing of property. That's something that really concerns me, because this new kind of feudal system, this Agenda 21 feudal system, is so draconian, and it's done scientifically and in a way with the 5G coming in, which is going to be very hard to get out of. I suppose it's a challenge. It's a massive challenge, yeah. And the debt slavery, that's pretty frightening as well. You know, now I've looked at loads of stuff over the years from the Russians. The Russians are brilliant at putting this stuff out, and yes, and I wonder if they've had a reply to their tweet about the Skripals from the Russian embassy asking the Home Office for some evidence yet of the poisoning. I don't think so, though. That would be wishful thinking. But the psychological society, you know, the scientific study of the human mind and behaviour, that the citizens of the psychological society, the most anxious, emotionally insecure and analysed population in the history of mankind, and that's why we get people on BBC and Sky News just able to subvert what's going on all the time, because subversion is the agents of change. It is the actual tool of modern psychology. It sits at the very centre of contemporary society as an international colossus whose professional minions number in the hundreds of thousands. And that was in the 70s when this quote came out from the Psychological Society. And basically, there's a very interesting point about all this as well, is this idea of this Russian general, when he actually describes the Bible as a management concept. And when you think about it like that, it puts things into a whole new light. A lot of this stuff's about perspective, to be able to constantly change your perspective on things. And that's something that the state does not take into account, because it can't. So thanks for that, Martin. That's great. What I keep reminding people, Martin says, is that the only way to disrupt the truth once it gets out is create chaff or half-truths to muddy the waters again. Just flat denial is very counterproductive. No smoke without fire concept. Oh yeah, that's right. I mean, this deny, disrupt, degrade and deceive protocol that's being used, even by your local council, is absolutely the template that can be busted. I mean, yes, flat denial is counterproductive, but what I was talking about earlier is much more effective, which is mirroring, which is basically when you out somebody for what they are, they just accuse you of being the same thing. So in other words, even people tonight on that silly Facebook say, sometimes I wonder who you work for, Mark. Well, I was self-employed, now I'm not employed at all. I'm doing this because I decided to take some time to see if it could affect a change. And part of it is the insular journey, the inward journey of actually being able to find things out and spend loads of time researching and having an outlet for that research. But this idea of the Bible as a management concept, that is just a brilliant analogy, you know, that this General Petrov came out with. Basically, that he takes apart the whole of the subversion process in a thing called Concept of Public Security, which is on YouTube, and that's something I've referred to several times, and I think it's a really important video that for anybody who wants to understand this stuff, you know, it's of paramount importance as to the way things are actually manipulated. And that's why I will keep reiterating these same kind of points, because they're so important. And what I've found out over the past few years, that this I'd like to share with people, is this idea that we are able to spot this stuff now, to actually be able to spot it and for it to be exposed. And I think what we're talking about tonight and this exposure that has been going on is a big part of something good that's coming out at last, you know. Uniquely, there's a book I called Have Jesus CEO, which speaks about a man who's trying to get 12 salesmen to sell a concept. Oh yeah, all those things are very, very revealing, very interesting actually. I mean, we're getting into really the way society works, and that's, to me, it's fundamental, because if you don't know how society works, then you've just got no reference points. You can't actually get to the bottom of anything. But basically, one thing I wanted to bring up tonight, there's been a few disruptions there with all this things going wrong. I'm having a few problems with these computers tonight. But community policing. Now, I've had some experience of this recently, and it's an absolute gatekeeping exercise where nothing gets done. And we've had a case that's been put into community policing, and the criminality, you would not believe the criminality that's gone on. And they're kept to their original promise, these police in North London, when they said nobody will be arrested. Well, what they've done is they've basically sided with a bunch of criminals, and it's all going to come out. This is going to be a big story that we're going to cover in the next few weeks, because it's so fascinating. And if you look at what community policing is and what communitarianism is, we did cover that, and these things are interlinked. Basically, trained agents are coming in who control the narrative, whether by apparent coincidence or design. And when you get these community police actually standing by when real criminality is happening, I mean, this has ended up with a property being broken into, the property stolen, and the property being put on eBay, and absolute proof with all the serial numbers of the property stolen given to the community police, and they're saying they might make some arrests. Now, these are the same community police who several weeks ago said they had a suspect because somebody had sent this agent to someone's house stating that there was a hit out on them and basically they were going to be murdered. And the community police said, we have a suspect. But of course they kept to their promise, no one will be arrested. So basically that's the situation. When we look into this, the community policing is just an excuse for lawlessness. Quite an interesting one, that. Yeah, Martin Houston. Yes, who is the shill? The person accused of it or the person doing the accusing? This is what the rest of us need to deduce for ourselves. That's exactly right. And basically what this comes down to is the quality of the information. And over the years, I've just put out information which is good quality. And I'll just back up everything that I say. I think if anything can be sworn as an affidavit, then that's fine. It's when you start actually confronting these subversives, like the cabinet member for the environment in Waltham Forest where I used to live. When I confronted him and said, I want a debate in front of the public who you claim to represent, there was no answer, because these people don't have any truth. They only have this kind of subversive agenda. So the same with all of it really. But yeah, community policing and community organisers, we've covered that quite a lot. That's a really important thing. So over our own intelligence services are facilitating this fake left poison and promoting fake far right reaction, thus demonising those who speak the truth. The media are sponsors of extremism in all forms and back up state-sponsored terrorism, and their gatekeepers range from useful idiots for climate change taxation, who we talked about earlier, and these useful idiots, like say, let's say Brian Cox, we did a show about him, say, you know, we challenge you on climate change, and of course he won't respond to us. And a friend of mine, Kevin, actually wrote to David Aronovich, and he stated that Aronovich was basically one of the worst gatekeepers in the media, which of course he is. And Aronovich said that my friend would be dealt with in a way which the powers that be know how to do. Basically an implied veiled threat, you know, and this is why you get people like Kay Burley being Journalist of the Year, you know. Reinforcement of expectation, that's all it's about. And yeah, really interesting to see the way things are actually shaping up now, because the whole narrative of the past few weeks, I've been watching this with this story that's come out, with all these people that I knew were wrong uns years ago, are basically now exposing themselves. You know, another story I wanted to actually get to tonight was that it's going to be compulsory to give away your organs unless you opt out. That's 5th of August, that's from the Daily Mail. The government is to press ahead with a radical plan to make almost everyone in England an organ donor unless they opt out. Now, this is absolutely Agenda 21 and the proof that we are owned by assumption. So that's the assumption, you see. You have to now opt out. The state owns you unless you can prove otherwise. Ministers say the move, dubbed dubbed Max's Law after a 9-year-old who benefited from heart. Oh, so here we go. Here's the benefit. Someone benefited will save hundreds of lives and result in 700 extra transplants a year. Yes, it will. And it will also, in my opinion, give them free rein to kill off more people in hospitals, because they're doing it on the basis of who's going to be more useful to the state, a person who's ill or someone who can be taxed to death who's fit and healthy. Well, it's a no-brainer really, isn't it? And that's what I was asked to cover a while ago by a friend of mine, all these deaths down in Hampshire and what happened there. I will actually cover that story because it outlines exactly what is going on in hospitals, and it's all pretty scary. There's been so many people genocided in hospitals. Well, we can't say genocided, I suppose, but ultimately that's what will happen. Uniquely presumed consent. Yeah, well, it's implied consent, isn't it? The implied consent. My question is, who the hell is writing the pernicious statutory instrument, and why write it in the first place? Well, I think you've answered your own question there, Lee. Why write it in the first place? Well, because you want to take absolute control of everything. That's the whole point of it, really, isn't it? Does the public will things like this? I mean, I think that basically there's two ways of looking at it, and it's a very important thing in that the way of looking at this is that from some points of view there's a custodial aspect, but is that custodial aspect there to dictate everything that you should do, say and be? No, it's not. It's not there for that reason. The government is meant to be there to actually serve us, and that's the major point, and that's one of the major points of this show, in that the way the intelligence services operate in this country is against the public interest. If it's against the public interest, why are they there? Whose interest are they serving? Well, that's really what the people who listen to this show are finding out. That is their job, because we come up across that all the time. You know, no court decision needed anymore. That's very true. Big changes to euthanasia law the other day. Yeah, we'll get onto that maybe next week. I'm just sort of running out of time here, but that's mainly because I had that break in the middle, and one of my computers has sort of crashed here. It's not behaving itself, so I'm having a bit of trouble getting to some of the things I was going to talk about, which is a shame. I'm just having absolute problems with the internet connection, which is messing things up rather. The whole computer is actually jammed. I can't even turn the internet off on this one, which is a bit of a shame. However, I think we got through most of what I wanted to say there, and I will be looking into this technical problem next week, because there's been a few things gone wrong, especially with this microphone. I want to get that sorted out, but yeah, I'm just having real technical problems tonight. So there is some advantages to recording a show. But when it comes down, Uniquely said, when it comes down to the idea, council perceives us to be on wards. Though that's right, what do they put in wards? People who are incompetent, people who are mental. There's only two places I know where wards exist, correct? Hospitals and prisons, yeah. Well, basically this all goes back to the poor laws, and we have covered all that. Oh, and lunatic asylums, of course. And that's the thing, yeah, when you look at this stuff, it's absolutely fascinating, and the occult nature of it. I want to put more of this stuff out. I was going to do a series on it, actually, about the law, you know, the law that we can still use, and that is effective, and things that I've used over the years that have become incredibly effective. And I think that's, in summing up, what I wanted to sort of get across, that even with these goons who are trying to disrupt everything, there's still the natural law and the way things actually operate, and they can't really fight against that. And I've found that to be tremendously helpful in countering a lot of these counter-intelligence people, which we can actually take down to every level now, because the community organisers and these people who are getting promoted as change agents, they're all subversives in actual fact, and the danger is that they don't know that they're subversives, which is a real problem. Actually, I'm running out of time now because we started a little bit late, and I want to make sure that we get the show into 2 hours. So I'm going to sign off, and thanks to everybody who's been in chat, and I'll definitely be back next week, and we've got some talks coming up, so those will be advertised on the website. And Thanks for listening to Windows on the World, and we'll see you next week at 9 p.m. Thanks a lot, everyone.